Here's continuation of a conversation we started last Friday here on All Angles. You'll remember that for Heritage Day, we were broadcasting live from what remains of the historic Lovedale printing press in Alice in the Eastern Cape. We covered much ground on the undoubted historical significance of the situation, of the institution rather, and also the hard times that it has fallen on and the pressing need to rescue and preserve it and its legacy. But one of my guests on the day, Dr. Athambile Masola, felt there were significant omissions from that conversation and that it needed to be located within the broader context of the knowledge economy. She joins me now to take that conversation forward. I couldn't leave you, Dr. Masola, dissatisfied with whether or not we had done justice to the conversation around Lovedale Printing Press, its place in history and legacy. You felt that we needed to not only be looking in the rear view mirror, but looking at where we are, the state of play right now in as far as the knowledge economy is concerned, and also looking at the windscreen in terms of where we are going. What did you mean by that?
Thanks so much to Leslie for indulging me and really giving me this opportunity to, I think, expand on a really important conversation. So I think one of the things that we kind of glossed over in last week's conversation was that the Lovedale Press occupies a really complex nexus. By that I mean it offers us a lens into heritage. They are custodians of heritage. They are a publishing company, which means they're part of the knowledge economy, and they are part of the small business enterprise in a sense. And so those three things really speak to a complex position. So they're not only important because they have a historical legacy, but they also speak to the problems that we're facing in publishing broadly in South Africa, particularly for Black publishers, but also if we think of publishing in a place like the Eastern Cape and the knowledge economy in the Eastern Cape. And so we really find ourselves in a really so put it another way, part of the demise of the Lovedale Press is because of the entire system. So any independent publisher in South Africa will tell you right now that part of the problem is not so much that Black people can't publish books or Black people are struggling to publish books, it's that the entire system is problematic and has been problematic for a very long time. And so what does it mean then for us to isolate Lovedale Press as though it's the case of a few individuals who couldn't get their tax compliance together, which is part of the picture that the guest that you have, I think it was Musisi, we're from the Department of Arts and Culture in the Eastern Cape, that actually there's a broader ecosystem here that we need to think about institutional building, but a particular kind of institutional building when we're thinking about knowledge production in South Africa, but more particularly in the Eastern Cape. So for example, for someone who's just published a book in isiXhosa, I'm born and bred in the Eastern Cape. It was very difficult for me to get a sense of how and where my book is moving. I had to literally call booksellers in East London and to say, hi, have you stocked the books? It was me and a colleague, and to say, hi, have you stocked our books? Now, that tells you something about there is a difficulty in movement, right? But somehow Lovedale Press historically was able to deal with that kind of movement because in 1934, when Victoria Swartboy's book was published, Umandisa, she had 4,000 copies, and that was her first print run. Any writer in South Africa would be hard-pressed to have a print run like that, but let alone it being able to move through the Eastern Cape. So what does it mean to make things move in the Eastern Cape, given that there is this historical legacy, but also we're now faced with a situation where East London and Port Elizabeth are probably the only two hubs insofar as how we think of knowledge, the knowledge economy. If you go to Egonza, there's no bookshop. If you go to Mthatha, there's no bookshop. People are maybe buying from CNA. And so what you're seeing is how does knowledge move in the Eastern Cape? But also, how is that related to the Department of Education? Because the historical model that the Lovedale Press had before was that it was deeply implicated to the education department. So even while we want to only make it the business of Department of Arts and Culture, I think people from the Department of Education need to come and tell us, where are they getting isiXhosa books for primary school and high school children? Are they getting them from the big corporations? And what are the implications of that for a place like Lovedale, whose business model was deeply connected to the education system?
I have a feeling that you posed that question, but you also have your own sense of what the answer is then, in terms of creating demand for the services of the independent publishers, but also small and black publishers, as well as the historical centers such as Lovedale. I have a feeling that you have your own sense of where the machine is broken.
Just struggling a bit here with my connection. I hope you can still hear me.
I can still hear you, yes.
Okay, great. So the chat, I mean, the answers are obvious. You're absolutely right, is that there is a broken telephone that has huge implications, particularly for black publishers. So, for example, a few years ago, there was a publishing company called Vivlia. Vivlia occupied a particular niche, particularly in the Eastern Cape. But now, with changes in caps, one of the things the Lovedale custodians told us is that as soon as caps kind of came into play, they were left behind. And so the people who can keep up with the demands of caps and with the changes in the caps curriculum have been the bigger publishers who have more capacity, who have more researchers, who have more staff available to them. So when we talk about the Lovedale Press's demise, we need to talk about the relationships that have been broken over time. So there should have been a vested interest by the Department of Education, particularly in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, because that's where ISXhosa is concentrated, to making sure that not only are there new books that Lovedale Press can produce, but how are the historical texts that Lovedale is so famous for being used in the current curriculum. So I used to be an English teacher. No English curriculum doesn't have Shakespeare, and we've never struggled finding Shakespeare. So it seems strange to me that we would struggle finding incwadi zika A.C. Jordan, finding incwadi zika Muzora Fuchane, finding incwadi zika Victoria Swartboy. And that's because that chain has been broken. So, I mean, a colleague and I, Annelile Kibeteko, wrote about this in a publication that we were asked to buy, Mistra, where we were talking about this very problem with the knowledge economy, but particularly for indie publishers in relation to the school market. And it's a rigmarole. It is something that is really underplayed, and your big companies have really fortified themselves. To some extent, people say that it behaves as though there's a monopoly. So I can give you 3 big names right now. I won't give them free advertising. I've already mentioned them. But you can think of a few big names who have really occupied that space. And there's something to be said about why has that been allowed to happen and how we then address that if the future of Lovedale is to be secured. So for me, in order for Lovedale Press to survive, we need to go back to the drawing board and think about where do we put these books in terms of the education system, but also more broadly, the question of black people reading for pleasure. There's also this weird myth that black people only read because they are in school. And somehow reading in for pleasure is something that we don't talk about anymore. And so how do we build a campaign around that in saying that these books are not just for the school market, but they're also for our own sense of identity and our own sense of history as black people.
Wow. Dr. Athambile Masola, thank you. I'm glad that I gave you a second take because clearly there's a whole pathway of conversation that's worth having. It's not the first time I hear this conversation, but I think you've taken it a step further and thrown out the challenge for many of us out there to consider the situation around the publishing industry as well as the value chain known as the knowledge economy. So the conversation, there you have it, has started, and I wonder if there's anyone from the Department of Basic Education, Higher Education, etc., who's willing to pick up the gauntlet from where Dr. Athambile Masola has thrown it. I'll be very happy to host you and continue this conversation here on All Angles. Where else?